Hello and welcome to the Vitality Hour here on Fitness TV. My name's Nana Akweer, aka Lady Exercise, and I'm here with Dr. Nick Reed. He's about to do a talk on a subject that affects so many people in this country. Dr. Nick, tell us about what you're going to be talking about.
I'm going to be talking about irritable bowels, and in particular I'm talking about food and mood. The way that food affects the bowels and the way that the way we feel, our moods, also affect how foods affect the bowels. A lot of people think that they have food allergy. If they have something wrong inside of them, they think they have a food allergy. In fact, food allergy is very rare. Only about 0.5% of the population have a food allergy. Many people have a food intolerance, but it's not necessarily the fault of the food, it's the fault of the gut. The gut has become sensitive, and that's the message I want to get across. It's the fact that if there's something going on in your life, if you're tense about something, if you're excited about something, your bowel's going to become very sensitive, and it's going to be very sensitive to much of the food that you take in. So that when you see somebody who says, oh, I can't eat this or I can't eat that, ask them, how long has this been there? When did it first happen? What's going on? When does it get better? When does it get worse? And then you begin to get a handle on what's going on. So that's the message I want to get across today.
Oh, that's a great message, and we look forward to finding out how viewers can sort of help to alleviate these symptoms and hopefully, get a bit better. Thank you, Dr. Nick Reed.
You're
Looking
welcome.
forward to your talk.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Nice to see so many people here. I hope you haven't all got irritable bowel. Have you? Oh dear. Is it all right this morning? Sort of? Okay. Well, my name's Dr. Nick Reed. I'm a medic. I'm a gastroenterologist. And some years ago, I retrained. Can you all hear me all right? Can you? Okay. I retrained to be a psychotherapist because at that time I was doing a lot of research in irritable bowel, and quite honestly, I didn't understand where we were going with it. There wasn't any good treatments for it. The diet didn't seem to work very well, and I wanted to get an understanding of what IBS was about. And the psychotherapy helped me. I'm not saying it's all in the mind or anything like that. By no means is it all in the mind, but nevertheless, the mind and the body they interact. They play a very important role in this condition. And this is what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So that's where I'm coming from. And my topic is food and mood, how the way you feel can influence how foods affect you. How the way you feel can influence the way foods affect you. So I'm talking about food intolerance, I'm talking about food allergy, and I'm talking about the gut's intolerance to food and why that's there. So let's start off where I started off as the doctor. A few years ago, I get referrals from doctors, and I had a referral from, say, this doctor, and the letter went something like that, something like this. Dear Dr. Reed, I'd be very grateful if you would see this pleasant patient. Doctors are very polite. They always call patients pleasant. It's really, really nice. But could you see this pleasant patient who has suffered with diarrhea for the last year? And then he explained the tests that he'd done. He said, I'd done a gastroscopy, a colonoscopy, a scan of the colon. I've done x-rays, a barium enema, barium meal and follow-through. I've done pancreatic function tests, lactose tolerance tests. I've done a trial of all sorts of treatments, diets and things like that, a long, long list. And he said the patient's still got diarrhea, and I don't know what to do. So, and that's not unusual. I tend to get, in fact, I tend to be, I regard myself as the last resort of the destitute at times, that I tend to get a lot of cases that are difficult, that don't respond to the medical model. And really, irritable bowel syndrome is one of these diseases that doesn't really respond to the medical model. And I always keep in mind something that I read years ago, that the old-fashioned physicians used to say it is better to understand the patient with the illness than to understand the disease in the patient. So understanding the person with their illness is much, much better. And that's been a kind of guideline for me as I've gone along. So this is the doctor, this is the presentation, and he said at the end, I think the patient has irritable bowel syndrome and I'm not sure what to do about this. So what is irritable bowel syndrome? Well, these are the symptoms. The symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome, as you all know, are of frequent abdominal discomfort and bowel upset. The abdominal discomfort can be bloating, can be abdominal pain. The bowel upset may be constipation, may be diarrhea, may alternate between constipation and diarrhea and go backwards and forwards. A lot of people say to me, well, how do you get a single disease that has diarrhea at one time, constipation at another time, belching at another time, all sorts of symptoms that vary and oscillate. And there are reasons for this, but it's to do with the individual patient rather than a disease that you can definitely diagnose or has got a pathology. Irritable bowel syndrome has no pathology. You can't identify any inflammation. You can identify changes in function of the bowel, but they alter, they vary from time to time. So it's one of these conditions that's more a reflection of the way a person feels and the way they lead their lives than a single disease entity. It's a non-specific condition. Many other diseases can give rise to the same symptoms. Abdominal discomfort, bowel upset, you can get it in celiac disease, you can get it in colitis, you may even get it in first presentations of cancer. You can get it in a number of conditions. So it behoves the doctor to rule out the most important conditions. The good thing at the moment is that there are quick tests available that effectively screen out the most important conditions that a person may have. There's good tests for bowel inflammation. It just takes a simple test on a stool sample. It can be done in general practice, called fecal calprotectin. There's a good test for celiac disease that can be done very quickly. There's good tests to screen out cancer. So the good news is we can screen out most of the common conditions. So we can be pretty sure of the diagnosis. And this can be done in general practice. It doesn't need to be sent up to a hospital to screen out these conditions. So IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, tends to be seen more as a disease of exclusion. You rule out the most important other things. What you have left is the expression of the individual, of what's going on with the individual, what they're eating, what's happening to them through the bowel. But there are also lots of other symptoms. Many of you may know that you haven't only got bowel symptoms, you may have headaches, you may have tiredness, you may have backache, you may have an irritable bladder. IBS encompasses all these symptoms. That's not to say that all these symptoms are IBS. It's more to say that IBS is one of the ways in which tension, changes in our lifestyle can be expressed through the body, and therefore it's not surprising that the symptoms that we call IBS overlap with all sorts of other symptoms. It's a very individual expression. It's an individual illness. And to be rather cynical about this, it's an illness that was defined by committee. And I remember being associated with these committees some years ago, and a group of doctors got together and they said, okay, we've got these patients with all these bowel symptoms, we can't altogether understand, what are we going to call it, how are we going to characterize it? And they came up with the term irritable bowel syndrome, and that sort of fits. But remember that IBS, when your doctor diagnoses IBS, he's basically saying, you've got these symptoms, but I cannot find a definitive cause for these symptoms. We're going to call it IBS, and we've got some medications that may help. And that's where we are in medicine at the moment, to be quite frank with you. I think anybody that says it's a definite disease and things like that is probably treating themselves more than you, if you see what I mean. So let me tell you a little bit more about Tim. This is the patient that was referred to me. You might say Tim's a little bit pixelated. He probably was. I think he drank rather a lot. But Tim was this patient with diarrhea. And the most important question to ask anybody when they come in with unexplained symptoms is to say, okay, when did these symptoms start? What was going on when they started? And Tim said, well, about a year ago. He wasn't very forthcoming, was Tim. He was a guy about 19, 20. His behavior was a little bit younger than that in a way, but he found it rather difficult to chat away. And I said, how long have you had it? And he said, well, about a year. And I said, well, what was happening a year ago then? What do you think caused it? And he said, dodgy fish. And I said, what do you mean, dodgy fish? He said, dodgy fish. I went out. I'd been out one night. I went into the fish and chip shop late at night. I had some fish. I was with my girlfriend. I went back, and the next morning I had terrible diarrhea. It was dodgy fish. And I said, well, you know, did your girlfriend have the same fish? And he said, yeah. And I said, did your girlfriend have diarrhea as well? And he said, don't know. And I said, what do you mean, don't know? He said, well, I never saw her after that. And I said, what do you mean you never saw her? He said, well, I dumped her, didn't I? And I said, well, yeah, how long had you been going out with her? And he said, 5 years. So this is a guy, age 20, 19, 20, first girlfriend, a close relationship for 5 years. That night, he dumped her. The next morning, he got diarrhea. And we carried on talking, and I said, well, you know, how did your girlfriend feel about this? And he said, well, she cried a bit. She shouted at me, and you know, and I said, well, and how did you feel afterwards? And he said, well, you know, I was all right about it, but then she went out with my best friend. And I said, how did you feel about that? And he said, and it's amazing really, that's the use of words, he said, I were gutted. I were gutted. And I said, you were gutted and you got diarrhea. Anyway, you know, to cut a long story short, we worked through this. We talked about it. He came to realize that perhaps, you know, he missed his girlfriend. It was quite a shock. It was really quite humiliating that his girlfriend took up with somebody else almost immediately. And he had this diarrhea, and his diarrhea eventually went away. It lasted another 2 or 3 months, but he found another girlfriend. He moved town. His life moved on. The diarrhea stopped. Now that's not an atypical story. It's the sort of story that I'll often hear in the practice I have, but it emphasizes the fact that it's very important to understand what's going on in a person's life, to understand their unexplained symptoms, and that's the message there. A lot of people with irritable bowel or bowel symptoms think that they have a food allergy. It's very logical to think that, because if you've got something wrong with your gut, then it must be due to something you've eaten. That's a logical thing in a way, but the fact of the matter is that allergy is very rare. Typical symptoms of food allergy probably occur in about 1% of people, maybe less than that. So food allergy classically is very rare. It's unlikely. Most people with irritable bowel syndrome do not have a food allergy. They have a food intolerance, which is a bit different. It means that foods can upset them, but there's no absolute allergic reaction. Foods upset them. So a food intolerance is not uncommon. Some people may have celiac disease. 4% of people with irritable bowel syndrome have celiac disease. It's important to do that simple blood test to rule it out. Your GP, if you ask him, if you've not had it done, will be able to do that. Some people seem to be very sensitive to gluten, and there's quite a lot in this show here about gluten and gluten sensitivity. Some people are very sensitive to fermentable sugars. The fruits, the vegetables, the broccoli, the onions, the plums, the prunes, all of these can give problems because they contain sugars that are fermented, that are not absorbed high up in the gut, are fermented in the colon and give rise to symptoms. So food intolerance is really quite common. And these are the main culprits. These are the foods that our guts tend to be more sensitive to, and if we have irritable bowel syndrome, these are the foods that give rise to pain. These foods will affect everybody in a way, but in most people, or in people who do not have irritable bowel syndrome, then you just take them. They may have reactions in the gut, but you don't feel it. All the sensitivity in the gut is damped down. You don't actually feel it. But these are the ones, if you've got irritable bowel syndrome, you've got to watch. Fat. Fatty foods will cause the gut to contract. Coffee will cause the gut to contract. Fiber, especially the insoluble bits of fiber, the woody bits, also they irritate the gut. Wheat, because of the gluten sensitivity, that may also irritate the gut. Fermentable sugars, a horrible term, FODMAPs, really means fermentable sugars, will do the same, plums, prunes, etc. And hot spices. These are the foods to watch out for that may upset your irritable gut. Let me say a little bit about these FODMAP things, because it's currency at the moment. A lot of people are talking about these FODMAPs. It stands for, and don't try and remember this because I struggle with it, it stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. That's what it stands for, but remember it is fermentable sugars. And remember it as plums, prunes, apricots, lychees, apples, pears, sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, sweet corn, peas, beans, lentils, beetroot, aubergine, peppers, onions, garlic, leeks, honey, bread, pasta, milk, and fruit juices. These are the foods that contain fermentable sugars, not absorbed. The sugars aren't absorbed in the upper gut, they're fermented in the lower gut. Now, that's a lot of food. If you exclude all these foods, you haven't got a very interesting diet, quite honestly. I'm a vegetarian myself, mainly. I eat a bit of fish, and I would hate a diet that had to exclude all these things. I would find it absolutely impossible. The reality is, you experiment with it. If you've got a sensitive bowel, you may find that prunes or plums or something like that upset you. Some of these other things, not so much. It depends on the level of sugars, and most important, it depends on the time. You may well find, and many of you may know this, it's sometimes you can take many of these foods with impunity. You can just eat them and there's no problem. At other times, when you sense that your bowel is upset, you can't eat them. And it's important you don't go on a strict diet and exclude them forevermore, because you'll probably never go back to them. And IBS tends to come and it tends to go. It tends to fluctuate. So don't regard these sort of diets as being an absolute rule. You've got to avoid them. Just experiment a bit. Just play around with them a little bit. So what I'm leading up to here is that food intolerance is more about the intolerant gut, the intolerant intestine, than the fault of the foods itself. It's about how sensitive your gut is. You imagine a scenario. Let's just take the skin. I've been out sunbathing. I come back, I've been in the sun for a couple of hours, it's been a hot day, my skin has become very sensitive. I put on my shirt hurts. It's not the fault of the shirt, it's the fault of the sensitive skin. It's the same in the gut. If the gut has become sensitive, it's going to react to a number of different foods, particularly the ones I've identified. Okay, so is it the intolerant gut? and it probably is. The food intolerance doesn't affect everybody. If it was the fault of the foods, you'd expect it to affect everybody. It's not specific. When we did research in this, we found that most people with IBS, they were sensitive not to one specific food, but to between 5 and 22 specific foods, and it varied. It varied, so it wasn't, this wasn't an absolute rule. It's not, as I've said, it's not all the time. The way the gut reacts is affected by what's going on in a person's life. It's affected by tension. Anything that excites you, anything that upsets you, anything that gets you going, any time pressure, anything like that is likely to make your food intolerance worse. And it's important to recognize that because you can do something about that. If you have an infection in the bowel, if you're getting over an attack of gastroenteritis, say, it makes the bowel more sensitive. So sensitivity of the bowel is important. And also the bowel reacts according, we are creatures of meaning. The bowel reacts according to the way we think about particular foods. If we think that a food for some reason is going to upset us, chances are it will do. So thought and gut feeling do tend to go together. Want to just mention here bugs and bloating. At this meeting here, you will see there are several slides, several stands on probiotics, on bacteria. We're used to the idea that we need to take probiotic cultures, live yogurts, to seed the gut with good bacteria. To a certain extent, this is helpful. There are some bacteria that produce a lot of gas. There are other bacteria that produce less gas. The theory here is if you take bacteria that are non-gas producing, you're going to react less to these fermentable sugars. That's the idea. The jury is out as to whether probiotics help everybody. I don't think they do, but they can help some people. Some people find them very helpful. Environmental change. Why have I got this slide here in a talk like this? The reason is that I was thinking about this the other day and trying to conceptualize it in a simple take-home message. As a doctor, I would recognize that illness, just talking broadly, is the net result of the interaction between a person, an individual, and the environment. You take any illness, it's that interaction. We take an infection, there's an infection in the environment, it affects some people. It's that interaction. Same with cancer, same with inflammation, same with any disease. The same with food intolerances as well. If we think of the place in the body that has more interaction with the environment, that's going to be the gut. The gut breaks down things in the environment, foods in the environment, all sorts of chemicals, all sorts of textures, all sorts of feelings and meanings about food, toxins. It breaks them down and processes them, so the gut is exposed to all kinds of things, and therefore it's not surprising that many things, many aspects of our environment go to the gut and affect the gut. Irritable bowel is common. It affects 15% of people, and I think it affects all of us at one time or other, but at any one time it's affecting 15% of people consistently enough for them to go to their doctors. Now, having said environmental change, the sensitivity of the gut responds to how tense we might feel, and the tension can go to the gut here. And if we think again, the host, the individual in the environment, what is it about our environment out there that upsets us and affects us? The answer is simple. It's other people. It's other people. It's our social environment. mainly. Yes, there may be disasters and things like that. We may lose our homes. You know, I'm not denying this, but the things that really upset people are the ups and downs of our relationships with our spouses, with our families, with our parents, with our children, the things that we worry about and upset us. And if we worry about some of these things and upset us, the gut is one of the first places it goes, and it can make us intolerant to the environment the gut faces, which is the food. And that's the logic behind it. So I'm always tending to ask people when they come with IBS, okay, you've got that. Let's just look at when this intolerance started. What happened? When does it get better? What happens when you go on holidays? Does it get better or worse? What happens at Christmas time? What happens if your mother-in-law comes to stay? Does it get better or worse? You know, just think what happens on Monday morning when you go back to work. What happens on Saturdays? You know, just think about what might be going on here. Now, let me tell you about something fishy. This is another story I want to tell you. This is about a patient of mine. And I'm going to call her, I can't remember what her name was originally. I saw her a few years ago. I'm going to call her Samantha, okay? Now, Sam was a young woman, late 20s. She had a full-time job. She had a steady boyfriend. She came to me with, she said, I've got food allergy, can you help me? And she told me that she was particularly allergic to fish, but also she started being allergic to fish, but it spread to all sorts of other foods. And it had been going on for 3 years. She'd had this for 3 years. She hardly dared go out because she'd get terrible diarrhea, and she was afraid of having accidents, so she was living a very reclusive life. And I said to Sam, okay, can you tell me when this first started? And she said, I know exactly when it started. And I said, okay, tell me when this was. And she said it was 3 years ago. My boyfriend invited me out to dinner, and she said I was excited about it. We'd been going out for some years, and I felt that this was the evening he was going to ask me to marry him. And she described how she got dressed up in a nice black dress. She put on favorite perfume. She made herself up. She was very excited about this meal. There's something portentous about it. Anyway, they went out for the meal. Nice restaurant they knew, favorite restaurant, nice fish restaurant. They ordered, she told me, salmon hollandaise sauce, something like that. Very nice bottle of wine, you know, everything set up. Boyfriend was a little bit quiet. He was a little bit nervous, a little bit quiet. And then he said, Sam, I've got something to tell you. And you know what's coming, don't you? And he said, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm having a relationship with Julie or somebody else. And he went on, and she's pregnant, and I feel I've just got to stay with her. And Sam left the table, ran out of the room, went to the toilet, was violently sick, had terrible diarrhea, didn't see her boyfriend again, rushed home. Within a few weeks she'd left town, she'd changed her job. She wanted to get rid of everything to do with that episode. She didn't tell her friends, she didn't tell her parents, she didn't tell anybody. She pitched up in clinic 3 years later with this food intolerance. So there was something fishy about this. Now, you know, she had, by the time she saw me, she'd seen a lot of really clever doctors who'd done a lot of tests, and nothing had been found. She didn't have food allergy. Fish is a funny thing to be allergic to anyway, and it didn't quite fit. But she was able to talk. When we talked for about 6 weeks, we talked about things, and slowly her symptoms disappeared. I saw her a year later. I discharged her after about 6 weeks. She was better in a way. I saw her a year later. She looked very different. She looked much more bright and lively. She just looked different. She told me she'd she got a new job, she met a new boyfriend, life was all right, and she didn't have symptoms anymore. So, you know, what was happening with Sam was the fact that the fish and this tremendous emotional trauma had become linked in her mind, so that, and she couldn't express the trauma, but what she could express was the food intolerance, and that's what was going on. So really, you know, in some cases, I'm not saying everybody at all, but in some cases, finding out a bit about the backstory or encouraging people to reflect themselves on what the backstory might mean is tremendously important. Memory and meaning. Illness can be conditioned by the situation, and it expresses not only the memory, but the meaning of what's happened. Anything that rekindles that memory, anything that reminds a person of what happened, will rekindle and evoke the symptom. It's like paths through the forest. The brain works, you know, if something keeps triggering a particular response, there's a strong pathway that gets activated very easily. It's anything that rekindles that memory. What about meaning? Memory and meaning. Now, food, as you know, carries a tremendous amount of meaning. We have feelings and meanings about food. We have thoughts, feelings about chocolate, about fat, about high fiber foods, about alcohol, about many different foods. We feel strongly about them. Think of the foods you choose to eat. You choose to eat those foods because they make you feel good or don't make you feel bad. In other words, foods have meanings attached to them. I was very interested in this, and I did a research project some years ago where I tried to find out not necessarily what allergies people had, although I tested that as well and there weren't any allergies, but what meanings they ascribed to food. And it was kind of interesting because, as you might expect, chocolate could be guilt foods, it could be a guilt food, or could be a treat. Some people said that chocolate could make them feel bad because they felt so guilty about it. Other people said, that's my one treat, that makes me feel good. It varies according to the individual. Some foods are control foods. I tend to like my control breakfast, which is high muesli and dried fruit, and a fruit smoothie that I make, and I think that keeps me in control. That's a control food. With other people, that might be too much. That's a really boring food and it makes me feel awful. I can't stand that. It depends how you feel about it. Some foods make you excited. They have connotations, maybe champagne, maybe caviar, maybe something exotic, may make somebody feel excited and may or may not give symptoms. Some foods will make people feel angry. There's been some nice studies done on vegetarianism and meat eating, and of course meat has connotations. It has connotations of blood, aggression, maybe masculinity. It can actually be a threat to some people. Other people really like it. It really reminds them of home. It varies according to where you've come from and what influences those foods have had on your life. One that I was really interested in the research project, so many people told me that they were allergic or sensitive to milk. And then when I asked about it and tried to find out what it was about milk, I was expecting it would be Mrs. Thatcher, you know. I was expecting, you know, school milk. I remember, did you, I don't know, some of you are of an age like me, and I remember school milk, and I remember you sucked it up through a straw and it made this sort of rather nasty sound, didn't it? It didn't taste very nice either, and but it wasn't that. It was often there was a problem in their relationship with their mum, you know, and I, you know, remember conceptualizing that and saying, well, milk, mother's milk. That seems to work for some people. It may be comforting for some people, it may be completely the opposite for other people. So connotations about food: home, a treat, comfort, and sex. There are foods that are associated with sex. and that may induce symptoms or maybe induce a nice feeling. You know, foods have a great deal of meaning. And food intolerance may start in childhood. And that's kind of interesting. And I think we can all relate to this, that we know when we have little children, they may have food fads. They're very fussy about food sometimes. You know, you've got to be, and nowadays I think it's even worse, because often parents will make the children their special favorite foods and have different foods themselves. Children can be very definite about what foods they like and what foods they don't like. And this is often where food intolerances may start, because this is to do with the tension a child may feel because of the thought of a particular food. I remember years ago my brother wouldn't eat apples, and Mum would often try and give him apples, and baked apples was a favourite that she used to like to cook, and he wouldn't eat it. And then she hit upon the ploy of calling baked apples with raisins and custard and things, calling them Simon apples. This was Simon apple. So this was special. And then my brother would eat Simon apple, and then it became Simon tomato and Simon this and Simon that. So we had a whole recipe book full of foods that he would then eat, and it got him out of the food intolerance. And that he eats everything now, but you know. So the meaning of food is tremendously important, and it starts often in childhood. Now, a bit of science on this. This is, I mean, I've tried to conceptualize why these things affect us in our body. What is it? It's not just magic. There is a science behind it, which is very important. It may be difficult to investigate, but it's important. And it's logical to my mind. When things happen, we feel them in our bodies. We all feel this. If something happens to me, I feel it in my body. If I park in the if I try and find my slot in the hospital car park and somebody has pinched it, I feel a sort of surging pain that sort of runs up from here and across my chest and things like that. And you know, no, I'm not having a heart attack, but I know I'm angry. These are the feelings of anger. Other feelings might be somebody tells us some sad news, we get a lump in our throat. We may notice that we're beginning to smart around the eyes a little bit. These are the feelings that we have from the things that happen. We all have this. It starts in childhood like everything else. Babies cannot express their emotions, but what they express are their feelings. And those mums among you, and there are many of them here, I know, would know that your little infants you know, they will have constipation, diarrhea at times, they will posset, they will vomit, they would scream with pain, and you know that the treatment for this is not to go to the doctor and get tablets and things, but to give them a big hug and make it better, calm things down and make it better. That's when it all starts. Now, as we grow up out of childhood, again, you will have done this to your children, I did it with mine, you start to relate, you start to sort of say, as well as the cuddle, it's okay, look, it's all right. You're feeling this pain because you had an argument with James and he always upsets you. Now let's think about how you can deal with him better. You know, in other words, you begin to bring the symptom out of the body into the mind and develop strategies for dealing with it. But the thing is that some symptoms, some things, we can bring to mind, and then the emotions make us think, make us act and talk, and the feelings will vanish once we can begin to bring those feelings to mind. But if there are things that have happened that are either so serious that we can't face, like Sam, she couldn't face it, she couldn't tell everybody, she was left with this feeling that she couldn't express, so she couldn't deal with it at all. All she could do was to take the feelings in her gut to the doctor. So if there's something serious that's happened that we can't acknowledge at all, or something's happened that produces such a big emotional reaction that we just can't manage it, then we're left with the symptom, and the only place that could be taken is to the doctor. And part of the role that I feel I have when I see patients is to try and bring these feelings about food back to mind where they can be dealt with. The other thing it's important to say is sometimes it's not what you eat, but the way that you eat it. Somebody made up a song about that sometime, didn't they? It's got a nice ring to it. And that's true. If we rush our food, if we're stressed when we eat, if we have an argument at the table, and many of, again, my patients said that they hated family meal times because mum and dad would always argue. There was always a fight over it, so that it became that meals were a dangerous place. So that's a recipe for food intolerance. So anything that happens that heightens the tension during a meal, give yourself time to eat properly, rest, relax, laugh, talk to friends, just take time out, give yourself good time to eat. That's the best thing. Then you're less likely to have problems and conflict. Now, I work nowadays, I'm sort of semi-retired from the sharp end of medicine now, and I work for this organization called the IBS Network. And we're trying to encourage a change in the way that irritable bowel syndrome is managed. Our campaign, if you like, our major campaign, is to enable people to understand their condition so that this isn't a mystery illness, it's something about themselves. And as far as understanding yourselves are concerned, you're by far and away the best person to do it. You don't want necessarily to come and talk to somebody like me and spill the beans and tell me everything about your lives, and I will get very tired anyway. So, but you can, given the insight that whatever happens to you can affect the way you feel and the way the gut reacts, that actually can, I think, help to provide you with the wherewithal to start to think how you might be able to manage your symptoms. It may mean dietary adjustment. It may mean understanding what the symptoms represent. It may mean trying to make that connection between the symptoms and what's happened. It may mean trying to find other ways, maybe relaxation, maybe yoga, maybe meditation, to regulate your emotions and manage your life. All of these things are really important. Now, we're not saying that you have to necessarily do this yourself, and one of the initiatives that we're trying to push forward is the idea that within the communities, within general practices, there should be health professionals, not necessarily the doctors, they could be nurses or dietitians or counselors or pharmacists or even expert patients, people who've got the drive to be able to help other people understand their illness, to facilitate self-care, because I think that's going to be the future in the health service. The government like it because it won't cost very much money. The government like it because we as the charity are helping to drive this. But it's the right way to go. It's the right way to go to be able to understand what your condition means, but to have somebody that you can talk to on a consistent basis who's not so rushed to typing on their computer the whole time, who's got the time to think and maybe work with groups to help this. So in the IBS network, we support people with irritable bowel syndrome. We've got a self-care plan that is going to be unveiled and rolled out this year. We've got a helpline of nurses that will answer telephone calls. We give medical advice by email. We have a series of self-help groups. We have a magazine and newsletter, and we give out can't wait cards for those people who've got diarrhea and just need to go to the loo quickly. So we try and provide a comprehensive resource service. And I find at the end of my medical career that this is something that I think is really worthwhile, that I would like to sort of feel this can make a difference. So that's us, the IBS network. Kirsty in the orange is at the back of the room there. Hello. And Kirsty has got some leaflets there if you want to know about the network. And if any of you want to have a natter with me, I'm doing some consults next door until 5 o'clock this afternoon. But thank you for your attention, and nice to see you here. Thank you.
Well, I'm here with Natasha D'Ancona from Activia. So Natasha, tell us a bit more about why Activia are here and what this TLC thing is all about.
So basically, Activia, TLC plan from Activia sponsoring the Vitality Show because it's the UK's largest wellbeing event for women. So we thought it was really, really great for us to sponsor it in order to get the message out there that our brand is all about being well, about making you feel great from the inside out, and just all about health really. So we sponsored the Health and Nutrition stage and the TLC Advice Lounge. And so this is basically a chance for consumers to come and talk to us about their issues on health, lifestyle, fitness, etc., all in the name of the TLC plan.
Okay, and behind me is a sort of consultation area.
Yeah.
What goes on in there?
So basically, consumers can come and raise concerns they have about anything from fitness, health, or lifestyle. And we have 8 experts here who are on board just to basically talk to the consumers, basically talk to them about their health issues and sort of give them advice for the future.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. So how did you get involved with Activia?
How did I, personally?
Yeah, how did you get involved?
I just liked the brand, I liked what they stood for, so I just started applying and I got a job there.
So that's it, another year and the Vitality Show is done. But it will be back next year with loads more stuff. So whatever you do, keep it locked to Fitness TV.